When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, Dickies. User, L09. Posted, June 12, 1998.
More coffee? The waiter's words brought me back from a stray thought I couldn't even remember once it had gone. He was standing in front of me, a name tag that proclaimed him as Martin pinned to his stained red uniform shirt. At some point in the distant past, his hair had been dyed blue, then left to grow out as if he had thought the color change might fundamentally improve some part of him, then bailed on it when life continued to be as shitty as ever. I nodded wearily and held up my cup. The deed done, Martin shuffled off to tend to the handful of other tables. Some were late shift regulars like the two girls, one tall and blonde, the other shorter with black hair down to the middle of her back, who always came in with a stack of study material and sat there drinking coffee refills for hours. Another steady presence was Brad, a balding, heavyset man who worked as a custodian at a local high school. He would wait until everyone had gone home for the day before starting work, buffing the floors in total silence. Then he'd come here and eat the same chicken fried steak every time. The remaining diners, 5 people across 2 tables, were older than the university girls, but younger than me and Brad. If I had to guess, I'd say they were post-gaming a movie. Every now and again, the overnight line cook, Juan, walked past the steel pass bar, bobbing his head to the music in his headphones. It was a quiet night until the bell over the entryway rang. One of the things that unites us as humans is our ability to spot crazy. If you don't believe me, go post up overnight in any Denny's and wait for one of them to come through the door. I don't even mean the homeless. I mean the ones close enough to the waterline to pass for normal. Their clothes in one piece, their nails clean. If there's something wrong upstairs, you know right away. It's the way they move, as if they're running a few frames faster than everyone else. The man who walked in that night looked exactly like that, reasonably well-dressed in a brown Dickies work jacket and khakis, his steel-toed boots laced up tight. His walk marked him out right away, neither smooth nor taxic, but something else entirely, a kind of stutter that made it look like he was taking every step twice. Brad noticed it next, followed soon by everyone else, their heads turning toward Dickies, who made it as far as the till. Martin, just coming out of the kitchen, was last to see him, and I could tell by how he beelined over to the newcomer that he hadn't clocked the crazy. Martin shouted at Dickies to step away from the till, and Dickies responded by screaming right back. Then he raised his right arm, except instead of a hand coming out of his jacket pocket, something that looked like a tentacle shot out and wrapped itself around poor Martin's throat. One squeeze, and I could hear the cracking of his neck from my table. That's when all hell broke loose. The movie kids lost their fucking minds and made a run for the front door, meaning they had to get past Dickies. He spun on them, his face now slack and rubbery, long, wet-looking appendages extending from both sleeves. They never stood a chance. One swipe of a tentacle sent half of them flying through the long windows fronting the restaurant where they landed, still on the frost-hardened grass. Another tried rushing straight at Dickies, only to have his momentum stopped cold when the second limb crammed itself into his open mouth, forcing itself so far down his gullet that his jaw broke, ultimately popping the top of his head off. One of the dead boy's friends took the opportunity to split and managed to make it out the door, running off into the night. The other one, a young lady, stood watching in mute horror as her friend, maybe her boyfriend, was torn apart in front of her. She didn't even react when the tentacle curled around her own neck and squeezed, crushing her throat in an instant. Her body dropped limply to the ground. I finally realized that this whole time, I wasn't doing anything. Not running out of the fire exit, not coming up with a plan. I was just watching. A quick look around showed me I wasn't the only one. The university girls were locked in place, their mouths wide. Brad was missing, and I couldn't see Juan anywhere in the kitchen. Had they left together? I had about decided that was the right plan when Dickie's sagging face turned toward us. Flesh pulling around his foot as if he was melting, he dragged himself towards us, the sagging flesh making a slurping sound on the linoleum. Our only path to the front door was now blocked. If we wanted to get away, we would have to use the staff exit in the kitchen. I tried to force myself up, and my body wouldn't move. It was like sleep paralysis, except I was awake, my mind screaming at myself to do something, anything. Instead, I watched Dickie shuffle his drooping body towards us, his tentacle wriggling as if in anticipation of what they were planning to do. He was only feet away from me now. I couldn't even look back toward the university girls, but hoped they had won the fight or flight lottery. The fluttering yellow appendages were inches from my face when the kitchen door burst outward, revealing Brad and Juan carrying square bins of white powder. Dickies turned toward them, his face swinging along a second or two after, just in time for both men. Brad first, then Juan, to throw the powder all over his clothes and exposed skin. Puffs of it made it as far as me, stinging my eyes and drifting into my open mouth. Was that salt? The sudden pain broke my paralysis, and I vacated my booth just in time to see Dickies collapse to the ground. He was twitching rapidly, his previously shiny skin shriveling up so fast it split, viscous green fluid oozing from the cracks. Brad and Juan returned with 2 more bins of salt, tossing them on top of the writhing figure. The additional salt made him retract further, pulling into himself, sending more ooze spewing out from underneath his clothes. In the distance, I heard approaching sirens. The kid who'd made it out must have called the cops. Dickies stiffened one final time and stayed still. Whatever he had been, he didn't seem to be a threat anymore. I wondered if I was still gonna have to pay my bill.
Subject: The Mattress Fort, Part 1. User: 17Searcher. Posted August 12, 1995.
January is the worst time of the year for this business. No one needs a PI to figure out if their husband is screwing around when they can catch him in the act at his office Christmas party. Once you've seen hubby standing there, pants around his ankles with Stacy from accounting bent over the photocopier, the image will never leave your mind. The last thing you need is someone like me providing you a photo. No, you know who does well in the post-holiday frame? Divorce lawyers. Some winters, when I'm sneaking free coffees in the lobby of the Sonesta downtown to save myself a few bucks, a law degree starts looking like a pretty good idea. Of course, then there's the books and the learning and the fact it took me years just to get a proper PI's license. The whole idea never gets past the concept page, and I find myself back in the office, hearing people talk about their lost pets. Lost pets aren't really my thing. They're usually not stolen as much as they wander off, and more often than not, if you can find anything at all, it's flattened remains on a nearby street. Non-pet people might have a hard time understanding this, but frankly, I'd rather tell someone I've found the remains of an actual human loved one than a pet. I've stumbled across both in my time, so I'm speaking from experience here. When I first hung a shingle as a PI, I took those jobs out of necessity. Nowadays, after ruining way too many pairs of pants, crawling around hedgerows, and seeing more crying children than a trauma counselor, I turn them down, even when money is tight. Please, Mr. Farmer, Strawberry is my best friend. He wouldn't run away. I know he wouldn't. The voice belonged to a 12-year-old girl named Anna Franklin. Anna had apparently found me in the yellow pages and snuck out of school to come here. To my great horror, she had then taken a series of buses downtown, showing the torn-out scrap of phone book with my advertisement to everyone she met until Linda, a hairdresser with a shop nearby, recognized it and escorted her over to see me. If this was the kind of area where it was even remotely safe to do something like that, I wouldn't be able to afford the rent. It's a goddamn miracle Linda got to her first. Anna had come because she wanted me to find her cat Strawberry, who'd been missing for a week. Her parents had told her to wait, that Strawberry would come home when he wanted to, but Anna wasn't having it. She was certain Strawberry was in trouble and only she could do something about it. That something turned out to be risking life and limb to come hire me because out of all the ads she'd seen in the book, mine felt right. Her words. Trying to map out the Gordian knot of bus routes she had navigated to get to my office gave me a headache. This was serious determination, and I felt bad about saying no. Instead, I'd been trying to convince her that her parents might be onto something, but how do you explain to a child who still has a mom and dad living under the same roof that sometimes cats up stakes and move in with someone else? The thing about cats, even though we love them, they're like roommates, and sometimes roommates. She was staring at me with a look that was equal parts confusion and annoyance. Move out, I finished lamely. Strawberry's not my roommate. He's my cat. We cuddle. He purrs. Do your roommates do that stuff? I don't have roommates. I didn't care for the look of pity she gave me. I like living alone. You have plenty of time to think. More pity. God damn it. Why was I telling her this? I'm useless with kids. Will you help me find him, Mr. Farmer, or do I have to try one of the other people in the phone book? More than anything, it was that did it. The thought of this kid ping-ponging around the city scared the hell out of me, so I agreed to help her, free of charge, so long as she would let me put her in a cab back home. The irony wasn't lost on me that it was already costing me money to do this job after turning down 2 other paying lost pet cases. Before she left, I took down Anna's information, including a phone number, address, and the name of her parents. Anna's mother, Nancy, was the one who picked up the phone, and when I explained the situation to her, who I was and how Anna had found me, she took it better than I expected. It gave me the impression that this might not be the first time Anna got a bee in her bonnet and decided to do something to spike her parents' blood pressure. She apologized for the trouble and thanked me for putting Anna in a taxi instead of sending her back home on the bus. Mr. Farmer, my husband and I will write you a check for the cost of the taxi. I know that can't have been cheap. Where would you like it mailed? Actually, Miss Franklin, I told Anna I would have a look for Strawberry. You and your husband are probably right, but I kind of admire her for being determined enough to come all that way to find me. It's only a couple hours out of my day, and this way she'll feel like she's done everything she could. I hope that's all right. That's very sweet of you. Anna is a very determined girl. You're right about that. Why don't you come by the house and pick up the check when you're in the neighborhood? I said that was fine and hung up. Her family lived in Newbury, a suburb 40 minutes away from my office. I locked up, hopped in my car, and headed west toward the bypass that led north of the Big Nowhere. The Big Nowhere is what used to be Midland's manufacturing district before those jobs started going overseas in the 70s. It was 20 square miles of industrial wasteland, old stockyards, warehouses, and factories bordered by two rivers, the Clark to the east, the Loire to the west. After a few years of gentrification chipping away at it from both north and south ends, the Big Nowhere was less than half the size. Above and below it were the new neighborhoods of Faunalis and Newbury, full of fresh-faced suburbanites looking for their own little corner of the American dream. Nancy Franklin was an olive-skinned woman with thick, dark hair tied back into a single utilitarian braid. She met me at the door of their surprisingly large house on Larchmont, inviting me in out of the cold. "You must be Mr. Farmer," she said. "Thank you again for making sure Anne got home safe. She'd thank you herself, but she's been sent to her room for skipping school and nearly getting herself kidnapped or worse." She shook her head in frustration. "It's no trouble, Mrs. Franklin. Like I said, it's a couple hours out of my day, and knowing she tried will help Anne pack it away when we can't find Strawberry." Mrs. Franklin frowned sadly. "I suppose you're right. We're not going to find him, at least alive. It's been so cold this last week that he couldn't possibly have survived out there." I shrugged. "It's not impossible. Cats are smart, especially when it comes to finding warm places to hide out, but in my experience, lost pets aren't usually found." She looked upstairs, no doubt imagining what that conversation was going to be like. "Do you know your neighbors very well, Mrs. Franklin? Is it possible Strawberry could be living with one of them?" It took her a moment to shake off whatever thought had been running through her head. "We know both of them well. The Harts live on our left, they haven't seen him, and our other neighbors, the Colemans, have been out of town since before Christmas. I think they're coming back soon, but I'm not sure." I asked a couple more follow-up questions, ridiculous stuff like if she knew whether or not Strawberry had favored places to hang out in the neighborhood. Of course, she had no idea. When I left the house with a check for the cost of Anna's cab, there was at least 2 hours of daylight left, so I figured walking around the neighborhood would be a good place to start. After an hour, the wind was starting to cut through my coat and was considering wrapping up the search early. Then I heard a young woman's voice call my name. "Mr. Farmer, Mr. Farmer, is that you?" She was in her mid-20s, pale skin, red curls spilling out from under her knit cap. The truck she'd just climbed out of was so big, I half expected it to split into two identical versions of itself. Why did she look familiar? My memory was working overtime, coming up with nothing. "Hi, yeah, it's me. How are you?" Awful, just awful. We still haven't found Hamlet. Is that why you're here? Did you change your mind about helping us?" Hamlet brought it home. Her name was Alexis. Hers was the other missing pet case I'd turned down, a German shepherd named Hamlet who disappeared from their yard. I'd completely forgotten that they also lived in Newbury. Well, sort of. Someone I know who lives a few blocks over lost their cat. I said I'd give them a hand, then remember you lived over here. Thought I'd stop by and see if you'd found Hamlet yet, but I guess not. She put her hands on her lips and tried to blow a wayward curl out of her face. "No, sir, we haven't. How terrible they've lost their kitty, too. That's so many pets going missing. It breaks my heart." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Are there more than 2? She nodded solemnly. "If you go to the square, you'll see the bulletin board is covered with posters. I don't understand it." She gave me directions to the square, which turned out to be Newbury's main shopping area, a pedestrian plaza with a bandshell at the center, ringed by chain retail outlets like Venture, Borders, and Funko Land. I carefully parked between identical BMWs, each of which cost more than I made in a year, and stepped out onto a meticulously salted and gridded sidewalk. Whatever the residents of this area were paying in property tax, it was worth it. Nothing in the city was ever cleaned up like this in wintertime. Even though it was a weekday, the plaza was bustling with people, mostly families, little ones bundled up in their snowsuits like tiny astronauts. It took me a few minutes of looking to find the notice board tucked away behind the bandshell. Like Alexis had said, there were at least half a dozen flyers tacked to the board, each of them bearing a photocopied picture of someone else's pet above a name like Beanie, Thumper, Scout, or Rambo. The ones that had dates went back as far as 2 weeks ago. 1 missing animal was a bad day. 2 was a shitty coincidence. This many in Midland? Only an idiot would think that was a coincidence. The flyers all had terrible slips of paper with a contact number. I took one of each and headed back to my office to make some calls. By 8 that night, I determined that, including Hamlet and Strawberry, 12 cats and dogs had vanished from yards in Newbury over the last 2 weeks. An hour later, I'd used pins to mark the locations of everyone's house on my wall map and discovered that, with the exception of the 2 cases which had been brought to me, all the disappearances were within a mile of the border between Newbury and the big nowhere. A stray thought occurred to me. Hadn't the other case I'd turned down been in Faunalis? I dug the name and address out of my notebook. Sure enough, there it was. Janelle Munn. Lost a Cocker Spaniel named Willie, lived at 321 Thornton Street. Grabbing a tag from the jar, I ran it along the map until I found the spot, roughly half a mile south of where that suburb butted up against the industrial park. Yeah, how many posters were there in the Faunalis Square? I wondered. Bet it was more than just poor Willie. My mind was racing. If someone was taking animals from both neighborhoods, it stood to reason they had to be coming from the big nowhere. Of course, that wasn't much help, given that even after the suburbs had been chiseled off from it, the industrial wasteland still had 9 square miles to hide in. I had to narrow down my search area, but how? The only people I knew of who went there anymore were crust punks who liked to hold their shows in the condemned buildings. I didn't know anyone in that scene, so who did? I ran through my mental Rolodex of late-night weirdos who might be able to help and came up with one possibility. Hollywood Jerry. Hollywood Jerry doesn't like it when you shorten it to HJ, works at Apex Arcade, right in the heart of the city. Apex has succeeded where other video arcades have failed through the one simple trick of selling drugs to bolster their bottom line. I don't know where I stand on the morality of that particular issue, except to say that having the place open at night gives kids somewhere to be other than out on the street, and house rules forbid the selling of said drugs, mostly weed and X, to underage. Jerry is one of the guys who helps enforce that rule. A good-looking guy and hard as nails. The boys call him Hollywood because he always talks about moving out to the coast one day and becoming an actor. We met years ago on the late-night circuit. Convenience stores, diners, arcades, bars, and anywhere else people gather when they can't sleep, and I'd helped him out with a thing maybe a year after that. He's dialed into a lot of the different social strata around Midland and can move through the crowd at a hardcore show in a burned-out storefront as easily as he can an Ivy League cocktail party. If he ever does light out for LA, he's gonna be fine. When I found him that night, he was standing in the alcove outside Apex's doorway, shivering his way through a cigarette. He waved when he saw me coming. "Farmer, how you been, big man?" "Doing all right, Jer. How about you?" "Same old. You coming in for a few games?" "Actually, Jer, I wondered if I could talk to you for a minute. I'm working on something." Jerry took one last puff on his smoke and tossed it out into the street. "Let's talk inside." Apex was busy for a weeknight. Groups of kids clustered around video game cabinets with names like Ninja Baseball Batman and Smash TV. Their shouts barely audible over waves of digital explosions and music. Jerry led me to a table in the back where the arcade conducted its more extra-legal business. It was quieter than the main floor, but still loud enough that anyone who tried to record a conversation was going to have a hard time. I explained the situation, lost pets, my theory about the thieves coming from the big nowhere. The expression on Jerry's face got increasingly grim as the story went on. "So what I need from you, Jer, is for you to press your connections with the crust punk kids. I need to focus my search, and they're the only ones I can think of who might hang out there. Maybe they've seen something." He glanced around the room to make sure none of the kids were breaking or stealing anything, then back at me. "Farmer," he trailed off. Pinball bumpers thumped out a rhythm as Jerry collected his thoughts. I waited. "I can talk to some of the crust kids if you like, as long as you understand it's not going to do you any good." "Why is that?" He let out a breath. "Have you ever heard of the Mattress Fort?" I hadn't, and told him so. I'm not surprised. It's kind of an urban myth, or at least that's what I thought. The big nowhere has a lot of hobo jungles in it. Why not, right? It's empty. The cops never bother with the place as long as you're not setting anything on fire. Each camp has its own name, a way to mark it out from the others. Xanadu, Copperpot, Hershiser, the Mac, weird shit like that. None of it makes sense unless you were there when the name was given. Before we ever met, I spent 6 months living in a tent in Xanadu, so I know a little about the system. The encampments each had their own personality, some rougher than others, but we were all afraid of the guys from the Mattress Fort. Jerry paused, his eyes haunted. He got up to fetch himself a Coke from the machine and came back, setting the sweating can between us. After another 30 seconds or so of silence, I prompted him. What made them worse than anyone else? There were rumors that they weren't human. They came from somewhere else. I know you've seen some shit around Midland, so you know not to dismiss something like that out of hand. They looked like humans, dressed like humans, all that. The difference was they didn't speak. And they were feral, by which I mean violent in ways you can't imagine. If you had something they wanted, they'd take it from you. They might even take you too. If they did, you were almost guaranteed to be gone forever. You couldn't even go looking for them because the Mattress Fort was never in the same place twice. It could even disappear right in front of your eyes and stay gone for years. "And you've seen them?" I asked. Jerry cracked his can of soda and sipped from it slowly before setting it down again. "I have. I was one of the ones they took." He didn't wait for my reaction, instead plowing ahead with his story. One night, an 18-wheeler jackknifed on the interstate just outside the big nowhere, spilling packaged food out over the road. I saw it happen and grabbed armloads of shit, mostly different kinds of cheese. Remember, I was living on the street back then, so this was like winning the lottery. Started humping it back to Xanadu, double time, keeping to the underpass. Out of nowhere, I smelled something like rotten eggs. Half a second later, it felt like a freight train rammed into the back of me and I was face down on the ground. I didn't stand a chance. The fuckers boot stomped me unconscious. When I woke up, I was hanging upside down, looking at the scariest bunch of guys I'd ever seen. They were filthy, more like a caricature of a homeless person than the real thing, if that makes sense. Even in Copperpot, which was so gross everyone else called it Piss Pot, you never saw this much grime. And the smell, Jesus, the smell. There were bones everywhere, ones that looked smaller like they'd come from animals, others were bigger. One of the ferals stepped forward. He was wearing a floor-length black coat, so dirty it was stiff, a Bowie knife in one hand. He didn't even try to communicate with me, just jammed that fucker straight into my guts, right here. Pulled up his t-shirt to reveal an angry scar above his belt line. Then, suddenly, it was all gone. The feral man, the shanty town, even the chains holding me up. If not for the rocking motion started by the stabbing, I'd have fallen headfirst onto asphalt. What about the knife? Gone too. That might be the weirdest part, because not only was the knife gone, but so was the wound. It scarred over instantly. No bleeding, no internal damage, no pain even. I got the hell out of there. And that was the end of my homeless days. I gave it a minute to settle in. Jer was right. I'd seen enough around Midland to make all of this seem plausible. The question remained, though. Jer, I believe you. I just don't know what this has to do with the missing pets. He drained the remainder of his Coke before pitching it into a nearby trash can. Those little bones. The old-timers, guys who'd lived in Xanadu so long they'd forgotten the lives that led before it, were the ones who warned us about the Mattress Fort. They said they knew it was coming because of the animals. Even guys living under tarps can have pets, and those pets were vanishing from all around the BN, dozens of them. Maybe the feral need to feed on lower life forms to build up their physical bodies. I don't know. All I know is it sounds to me like the Mattress Fort is back. And if so many cats and dogs are going missing, it's registering out there in the straight world, you can bet the crust kids won't be going back into the big nowhere until they know for sure it's gone again. Mind you, since they're already operating in at least the first mile of those new neighborhoods, it wouldn't surprise me if the other violence spread out that way too. Things are about to get ugly in the burbs. This whole time, I'd been operating under the assumption Anna's buddy Strawberry was no longer with us, a victim of careless driving or maybe someone's psychopathic kid discovering his kinks. Feral transients from another dimension hadn't been on my bingo card at all, and now that it was, it kind of pissed me off. Like we didn't have enough problems of our own without invaders from an inner space traumatizing kids and anyone else who couldn't fight back. Something had to be done. I didn't know exactly what that was yet, but I'd figure it out.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.